Zhang Ji sat in the dimly lit corner of a coffee shop, tapping his fingers on the ceramic mug with an absent-minded rhythm. The slight tremor in his hand was barely noticeable, but for him, it felt like a drumbeat in his bones. The city's vibrations, small, subtle, and nearly imperceptible to the average person, were part of him, a constant hum that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Today, however, the vibrations were off. They had been for days. A shift in the Earth's pulse, something offbeat and unnatural, tickled his senses like a whisper from the ground. The coffee shop was underground, one of hundreds of artificial settlements carved deep into the earth. The surface world, with its perpetual storms and volatile climates, was uninhabitable now, a distant memory from a time when humans had lived above ground. Below the surface, life had evolved, adapted, and taken root in sectors controlled by massive corporations. Zhang Ji worked for Pulsetech, one of the most powerful players in this subterranean world. His job, if you could call it a job, was to monitor seismic shifts, minor tremors that helped the company predict and control the stability of the city's foundations. But what he felt now wasn't minor. It was something bigger, deeper, and more deliberate. He glanced at his watch, 11:14 a.m., and then back down at the mug of coffee. The woman sitting across from him, Claire, was still staring at her phone, scrolling through the endless stream of news and updates, oblivious to the tiny tremors that rippled beneath their feet. "You know, you're kind of late," she said without looking up. "I thought the whole geologist thing meant you were a bit more punctual. You've got that nerdy reputation to maintain, right?" Zhang Ji raised an eyebrow and smirked. Claire, with her sleek, business-casual outfit and cool detachment, was the last person to understand his work. It wasn't her fault, really. Most people thought his ability to feel seismic shifts was nothing more than a parlor trick. But it wasn't. He could feel it, the subtle, yet ever-present movement of the earth beneath him. He felt it in his bones. "I'm not a geologist," he replied, swirling the coffee in his cup. "I'm a vibration expert." She scoffed. "Same difference." Zhang Ji shrugged. "You'd be surprised. You wouldn't believe how many people think I just feel the weather." Claire glanced up from her phone, half smiling. "You know, I'm still not entirely convinced you're not just making up this whole vibration expert thing." That's when it happened. A soft, deep hum, a low rumble that seemed to originate from the core of the earth, reached his senses. His pulse quickened, his body instinctively shifting, reacting to the warning before his mind could fully process it. It wasn't just a vibration, it was a full-on tremor. He felt it in his chest, his gut, like an ominous premonition. His eyes widened as he tuned in, trying to focus on the source. "I've gotta go," he said suddenly, pushing back from the table and standing up. Claire looked up, her face a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "Wait, what? Are you—" "I'm sorry, I have to go." He didn't wait for her to respond. He pushed open the coffee shop door and stepped into the narrow street outside. As soon as he was out on the sidewalk, the tremors grew more intense. The world around him seemed to shift, the buildings groaning under the pressure, the streets vibrating like the strings of an unseen instrument. His senses were on high alert now, his feet feeling the ground beneath him in a way that few others could ever understand. It wasn't just the usual seismic hum of an active underground city. This was different. He had to stop it. He had to warn someone, but who would believe him? The city had been built in layers, complicated, layered sectors designed to provide protection from the increasingly hostile surface world. The underground was a sprawling labyrinth of high-tech infrastructure and decaying remnants of earlier human settlements. And at the heart of it all was Pulsetech, the corporation that controlled much of the seismic engineering for the entire underground city. Zhang Ji had worked for them for years, but over time, his sense of unease had grown. The deeper he went into the systems, the more he realized how much Pulsetech was hiding. Zhang Ji pushed his way through the crowds in the sector's central hub, ignoring the stares from the passing commuters. His mind raced, trying to process what he'd just felt. He had to get to Pulsetech's facility, to their seismic data vault, and see what was happening. But the path wasn't going to be easy. There were always eyes watching. Always that he rounded the corner and entered the narrow alley that led to the back entrance of the Polstech building. The security guard at the door didn't even look up as Zhang Ji passed by, his ID card flashing before the door slid open. He moved quickly through the back corridors, hoping to avoid the eyes of his co-workers and supervisors. When he reached the main control room, the hum in his chest grew louder. There was something here, something wrong that he couldn't explain it. The floor vibrated beneath him with more intensity now. The Earth's rhythm was offbeat, like a song that had been thrown out of tune. It didn't feel natural that he was almost there. The seismic data vault was only a few floors down, but just as he reached the elevator, a voice called out from behind him, "Ji." He froze. It was Lei Yao, his boss, cold, calculated, and with a reputation for being ruthless. Lei Yao had always been dismissive of Zhang Ji's vibration expertise, but recently, things had begun to change. Zhang Ji couldn't help but notice how the higher-ups at Polstech seemed increasingly interested in his abilities, as though they saw him as a potential asset or a threat. Lei Yao stood at the end of the hallway, his hands folded behind his back. He wore a dark suit, his face expressionless as always. "What's going on?" Lei Yao asked, his voice low and suspicious. "You're acting strangely." Zhang Ji had only seconds to think. "I am just heading to the data room," he stammered, trying to sound casual. "Really?" Lei Yao raised an eyebrow. "Funny, because the data room's closed for maintenance today." Zhang Ji's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't risk it. He'd have to find another way in. "Right," Zhang Ji said quickly. "I'll come back later." But Lei Yao wasn't convinced. "You're not planning on telling me what's going on, are you?" Zhang Ji swallowed hard. He didn't want to lie, but the truth would never be believed. "Not yet. Not until it was too late." "No, nothing," he said. "Just checking in. You know, routine stuff." Lei Yao looked at him for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "You're acting weird, Ji. Keep it together. We don't need any distractions right now." Zhang Ji nodded, but as soon as Lei Yao turned his back, Zhang Ji's hand hovered near the hidden compartment on the elevator's control panel. With a barely perceptible click, the elevator's doors closed, and he was heading down. That he was going to stop whatever Polstech was planning. He had to. The vibrations were too intense, too deliberate to ignore. Zhang Ji's mind raced as the elevator hummed steadily downward. His hand gripped the control panel tightly, his pulse quickening. He could still feel the tremors, deep within his body, resonating in a way that made his bones ache. The low rumbling seemed to intensify as he descended, the walls around him vibrating faintly in time with the tremors. Every floor he passed felt like one step closer to the heart of the problem, and one step closer to the truth he couldn't yet fully grasp. When the elevator doors opened, he was met by the cold, sterile hallway of the data vault, a long, dim corridor lined with reinforced steel doors and high-security systems. He quickly scanned the surroundings. There were no cameras in the hallways this far underground. Polstech had learned long ago to limit their surveillance on the most critical areas. This was a place for the highest levels of secrecy. Only a few knew what was really stored in these rooms, and even fewer knew what was happening in them right now. The air in the corridor felt thick, heavy with the smell of old machinery and dust. He had to act fast. He walked briskly toward a door at the far end of the hallway, where a retinal scanner stood like a silent sentinel. Zhang Ji stood in front of it, his breath shallow, his heartbeat a drum in his ears. He closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a deep breath, then glanced at the timer on his wrist. The tremors beneath him were growing more violent. If he didn't act now, it might be too late. The retinal scan was quick and seamless. He'd hacked into Polstech's system months ago, anticipating a time when he'd need to bypass security. The door clicked open with a faint mechanical groan. As he stepped inside, the dim lights flickered briefly, and he paused, his senses on high alert. The vibrations were different here, more distinct, almost like an echo off a distant mountain. But it wasn't just the earth beneath him that was shaking. It was the building itself. Zhang Ji didn't waste time. He walked quickly to a set of terminal consoles, all of them humming softly. The data was stored on isolated servers in this room, encrypted beyond what most people could even comprehend. But Zhang Ji wasn't most people. He had spent years studying seismic patterns, and he'd learned to manipulate more than just the physical vibrations of the earth. He could manipulate information, too. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he accessed the company's seismic analysis systems. He quickly pulled up the latest data feeds. The first line of code that appeared on the screen froze him for a moment. It was a series of seismic event signatures, large, powerful waves, like the aftershocks of an earthquake, but there was no record of any natural events. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was something orchestrated. He scrolled down the screen, his eyes scanning quickly, reading the patterns. The numbers didn't lie. Polstech was planning to trigger an artificial earthquake, and it wasn't just any earthquake. This one was designed to be catastrophic, the kind of disaster that would level entire sectors, force massive evacuations, and allow Polstech to take control of the reconstruction process. A corporation that could control the very ground beneath people's feet would be unstoppable. Zhang Ji felt the blood drain from his face. His mind screamed at him to act, to stop the countdown that was already in motion. But how? There was no way to stop this from happening once it started. His only hope was to reach the central system, to somehow override the triggers that were embedded deep within Polstech's seismic control network. He frantically searched through the data for the master control system, but the encryption was more sophisticated than anything he had seen before. Every time he tried to break through a layer, another appeared. The system was designed to resist any unauthorized access, but Zhang Ji wasn't going to stop. He dug deeper, his fingers moving faster, the hum of the computer's cooling fans almost drowned out by the rumbling under his feet. Suddenly, the door behind him opened with a sharp hiss, and a voice called out, "Too calm, too controlled." "I see you found it." Zhang Ji froze. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The voice was unmistakable, cold, calculating, with the kind of authority that demanded obedience. "Lei Yao," Zhang Ji said, without turning to face him. "You always were the curious one," Lei Yao continued, stepping into the room. He was dressed in his usual dark suit, his expression unreadable. "Always poking around where you shouldn't. I warned you, Ji. This is bigger than you think." Zhang Ji's pulse quickened. The vibrations under his feet were now so intense that they felt like they were shaking the very walls of the room. But it wasn't just the ground that trembled. There was a chill in the air now, a shift in the atmosphere that made everything feel like it was teetering on the edge of disaster. "What the hell are you doing?" Zhang Ji demanded. "You're going to destroy everything down here. You're playing with lives. You can't control this." Lei Yao didn't flinch. "Control? That's exactly what I'm doing. I've spent years building this, Ji. Years of planning, of manipulating the very foundation of this city. And you're standing in the way. Do you think you can stop me?" Zhang Ji turned to face him now, his eyes narrowing. "You're insane. You don't understand what you're dealing with. You're pushing things too far. It's not just an earthquake, you're creating a collapse." Lei Yao smiled, but it was a smile of quiet victory. "You think this is about the earthquake? It's never been about the earthquake. This is about power. Once the city is in ruins, the reconstruction process will give us control over every single sector. The government, the people, they'll have no choice but to rely on us. We'll own everything. And you, Ji, you've been a useful pawn in all of this. But now, you're a liability." Zhang Ji's mind raced. He had to stop it. He couldn't let Lei Yao go through with this. He couldn't let Polstech be the puppet masters of this entire city, controlling its fate through artificial tremors. In that moment, Zhang Ji realized that if he didn't act now, if he didn't make a choice, everything he'd fought for, the people he cared about, the city he'd spent his life trying to protect, would be lost. Turn it off, Zhang Ji said, his voice low, deadly serious. I'll give you one chance, Lei Yao. Shut it down, or I'll make you regret it. Lei Yao looked at him, unimpressed. You're out of your depth, Ji. This is beyond you. There's nothing you can do. Zhang Ji didn't flinch. He moved quickly, his fingers flying over the keyboard. He had one last trick up his sleeve, one final way to override the system before it was too late. As he pressed the final command, a sharp beep echoed through the room, followed by a deep rumble that seemed to come from the very core of the earth itself. The ground beneath them shook violently, and Zhang Ji knew that if he didn't act fast, everything would be lost. He felt the weight of the world crashing down on him. But this time, it wasn't just the vibrations he was sensing, it was the knowledge that he was on the verge of making a choice that could change everything. Goodbye, Lei Yao, Zhang Ji muttered, and in that moment, he pressed the final command, his body tensing as the world around him exploded into chaos. The world exploded around him. A deep, primal roar rumbled beneath the earth, a sound so powerful that it reverberated through his body, shaking every fiber of his being. The walls of the control room quaked, and the lights flickered violently overhead, casting the room in eerie shadows. It felt like the very ground beneath him was coming undone. Zhang Ji gritted his teeth, his hand steady on the console as the tremors surged in waves, the city seemingly coming to life with a violent, uncontrollable energy. The monitors blinked wildly, static rushing across the screens as Polsteka's seismic systems began to break down. His command had been simple, but its consequences were far-reaching. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing the room in a dim, red glow. Alarms began to sound, their shrill wails piercing the air. The vibrations beneath him were no longer subtle, they were chaotic, a frenzied earthquake escalating far beyond the levels he'd ever experienced. And yet, despite the alarms and the disaster unfolding, Zhang Ji felt an odd sense of calm. He had made his choice. There was no going back now. Lei Yao, for his part, seemed unfazed. He stood motionless, his eyes locked onto Zhang Ji with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The tremors increased, now so intense that it was nearly impossible to stand, but Lei Yao didn't move. He simply watched, his lips curling into a grim smile. You really think you can stop this? Lei Yao's voice was steady, almost amused, as if the catastrophe unfolding around them was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. Zhang Ji didn't answer. He didn't need to. He was too focused on what was happening now, on the pulse of the earth beneath him, and the data on the screens in front of him. The feedback loops had triggered the system's failsafes, and the catastrophic artificial earthquake that Polstek had engineered was now spiraling out of control. He had done it. He had severed the connection between Polsteka's seismic control network and the primary detonators. For a moment, it seemed like everything had stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, the emergency alarms quieting as the feedback loop momentarily halted. Zhang Ji dared to breathe, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. Had he succeeded? Had he really stopped it? But then the ground shook again. This time, the vibration was so intense that the building seemed to groan under the strain. The walls rattled, and the lights burst into a shower of sparks as the entire facility seemed to tremble in protest. The shaking continued, building in intensity as if the earth itself were rejecting the interference. Zhang Ji staggered, bracing himself against the console, but the tremors were relentless. The feedback loop wasn't gone, it was amplifying, gaining momentum. Polstek had designed the system with a failsafe to override any attempts at disabling it. Even with his knowledge and his skills, Zhang Ji couldn't stop it. Not now. Not without more time. The seismic waves he'd intercepted were pushing forward, too powerful now to halt with any simple command. The building's foundation groaned beneath them, the metal beams bending under the strain as if the earth itself was about to swallow them whole. Zhang Ji realized, with growing horror, that his actions had not saved the city, they had only delayed the inevitable. God damn it, he muttered under his breath. Lei Yao's smile had vanished. His eyes flickered, a shadow of doubt creeping across his face as he stepped closer, his voice barely audible above the rising noise. You can't stop it, Ji. You never could. Zhang Ji's eyes darted to the screens. The seismic readings were off the charts. The artificial earthquake was no longer contained. It had spread, rippling through the entire city, sending shockwaves through every sector, destabilizing the infrastructure. Pulstech had created something that no one could control, and now it was too late to reverse. He had no time to dwell on the magnitude of what had happened. His mind raced, grasping at the fragments of his plan. If he could just access the city's central grid, there might still be a way to shut it down manually. He had to get to the core systems. But with the tremors increasing and the facility on the verge of collapse, every second counted. We need to leave, Zhang Ji said, his voice sharp with urgency, as he turned to face Lei Yao. Now. Lei Yao stood unmoving, his expression unreadable. The tremors continued to build, now rattling the very foundation of the facility. He finally turned his gaze away from Zhang Ji, looking at the chaos unfolding around them. Zhang Ji didn't wait. He bolted for the exit, ignoring the blaring alarms and the disorienting sway of the building as he ran through the darkened hallways, each step accompanied by the tremors beneath his feet. The sound of the earth's violent shuddering was deafening, like the world was being torn apart. Behind him, the sound of hurried footsteps signaled that Lei Yao was following, though whether out of fear or obligation, Zhang Ji couldn't tell. As they reached the elevator, Zhang Ji slammed his hand on the control panel. The elevator doors slid open with a loud, metallic hiss, and he shoved Lei Yao inside, not waiting for a response. The elevator descended rapidly, the floors whizzing by as they hurtled toward the surface. But the journey was far from smooth. The building swayed violently, as though the earth itself was protesting their escape. The trembling beneath their feet was constant, relentless. When the elevator finally stopped, Zhang Ji didn't hesitate. He rushed out the door, into the main lobby of the Pulstech facility. The air was thick with dust, and the windows had shattered, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor. The once pristine interior of the building was now a wreck, a symbol of the destruction that was unfolding. The surface was a different world entirely. Outside, the sky had darkened with thick, swirling clouds, and the ground was shaking violently. The city's underground infrastructure, once a marvel of human ingenuity, was now being torn apart by the very force it had tried to control. Buildings crumbled in the distance, and dust and debris filled the air. The city was falling apart. Zhang Ji felt the weight of it, all the consequences of his actions, the disaster he had inadvertently triggered. But it was more than just a collapse of buildings. It was the collapse of a system that had placed power in the hands of those who would stop at nothing to control everything, even the earth itself. He turned to Lei Yao, who stood just behind him, his face pale and drawn. You did this, Zhang Ji said quietly. You created this. Lei Yao didn't respond. He was looking at the horizon, where the tremors were still causing the earth to shift, the once stable ground now an unpredictable, shifting nightmare. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in the distance, a distant rumble echoed, a far deeper sound than any of the tremors they'd felt so far. Zhang Ji's eyes widened in realization. The artificial earthquake wasn't done yet. It was just the beginning. There's no stopping it now, Lei Yao finally said, his voice eerily calm. You might have delayed it, Ji, but this is bigger than us. Bigger than anything we can control. Zhang Ji stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, as he looked out over the crumbling city. He knew that the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The truth he had uncovered, the power and greed behind Pulstech, the corporations that controlled the world beneath the earth, was a truth that the people would need to confront. And now, he was one of the few who knew it. The world was changing, but the question was, who would rise from the ashes? In that moment, Zhang Ji realized that his battle was far from finished. It had only just begun.